Okay, a very warm welcome everyone to our seventh public lecture of the focal topic here, Justice and Sustainability. My name is Henrike Knappe. I'm leading this focal topic here, and we are kind of, we created this focal topic here in order to shed more light on any kinds of justice concerns in sustainability politics and research. Of course, this concerns a lot environmental justice and climate justice, like unequal effectiveness of environmental hazards, climate change, etc. But we also want to focus on justice concerns that arise in transformation processes, for example, in policy instruments being applied in sustainability transformations, etc., etc. So how they kind of are embedded in inequalities, for example, or how they also can produce maybe more equality, or also can create injustices in themselves. And therefore, we have different formats that we are applying this year. And one of them is this public lecture series that you are now welcome to join today. And we are very happy to have Matthias Fritsch here, who will speak about indigenous climate politics and justice between generations. And I think this is also one of the core topics, so to say, of justice and sustainability, the question of intergenerational justice, of course. So we are happy to have him today, and return to my colleague, Kanata Tillman, who will introduce him to you. Thank you. Yes, sorry.
So a very warm welcome from my side as well. So it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Matthias Fritsch today. Today Matthias just came from Berlin, but he's based at the Concordia University in Montreal, Canada, where he's a full professor of philosophy. And his work, for example, includes the book Taking Turns with the Earth, Phenomenology, Deconstruction, and Intergenerational Justice. That's like one that is most important maybe for our topics as well. And he also published over 40 articles in scholarly journals and chapters in anthologies. And in the past, he researched and taught at the Goethe University Frankfurt, Kyoto University, and Western Sydney University. And next year, he will also be a Humboldt Fellow at the Free University Berlin. Overall, his research interests include environmental and intergenerational politics. And currently he is writing a short book on civil disobedience in the face of global heating. So Matthias, a very warm welcome. We're happy to have you, and are looking forward to your presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much.
All right. Hello, everyone, online and in person. Thank you so much for coming. I am a native speaker of German, so if you want to pose a question later on in German, I'm happy to listen to that and receive it and answer likely in English, I suppose, but feel free to ask a question in German if you want to. So let me see that I can share my PowerPoint with you. Let me see. Not yet found. Okay, here we go. We're getting there. Thank you for your patience. Does that look good? Okay, great. Thank you so much. So, so the relationship between my talk and the PowerPoints is a little bit loose. And so sometimes, I don't read what's on the PowerPoint. I speak a bit more freely and independently of the PowerPoint. So they're like an additional source of information. Why indigenous peoples and the climate? Why pay attention to indigenous peoples and climate politics, even for non-indigenous peoples? Well, generally, I would say we speak of justice and sustainability, the title of the series, or in policy lingo, just transition, in recognition, I would say, of a dual task. the transition to sustainable living for the sake of future generations, but to do so while taking into account massive injustices in the present and the threat of throwing the most vulnerable people once more under the bus. So we have a task of intra-generational and intergenerational justice, and that's how I understand justice and sustainability. So I want to congratulate the Institute for this series of talk and for this title, and I think I'm addressing it. I hope I am. The danger, of course, is particularly acute, I think, for Indigenous people, as many Indigenous people suffer both from climate change and from action on mitigation and adaptation. You may have heard of hydro dams, afforestation, and so on, various policies meant to address Indigenous peoples that, however, are very much in danger of sidelining Indigenous peoples once more. Further, Indigenous peoples make up less than 5% of the global population, but despite the legacy of colonial land dispossession, they manage or hold tenure over 25% of the world's land surface and support about 80% of global biodiversity. Further, given Indigenous knowledge of land and intergenerational teachings, Indigenous peoples are central to protecting nature and fighting climate change. In addition to the importance of respecting their rights in the face of global mining firms and agribusiness. And last point, why Indigenous peoples and climate politics. Indigenous peoples are often at the forefront of resistance to new fossil fuel extraction projects. So in Canada, where I live, for example, the Wet'suwet'en peoples, as we speak, are blocking access to their traditional territory where a pipeline is meant to be built. So I can use this too. So this is the abstract of my talk. This was a preamble, as it were. So though every party will be adversely affected by the ongoing failure to curb emissions, and exacerbating injustice of climate change is the fact that the emissions as well as the worst outcomes are very unevenly distributed. The major emitters, largely in the global north, tend to be less affected than those most vulnerable to climate change, such as small island developing states, least developed countries, and Indigenous peoples. The stark inequality has to do with fossil fuel industrialization and its historical links with colonialism, the slave trade, and the dispossession of Indigenous populations. So as the Canadian Indigenous Climate Change Action Network recently declared in rather bold terms, colonialism caused climate change, Indigenous rights are the solution. So that's sort of the background of what I wanted to discuss today. Now, I have a bit more of a preamble, but I'm going to skip that in the interest of time, if that's fine. So now what I would like to do then is discuss Indigenous responses to climate change. And in the first section, I review various critiques on the part of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous philosophers in particular, with respect to seeing climate change as an issue that lies wholly in the future and is future focused. Along with that, I will seek to show goes a critique of the notion of linear time, namely that a timeline that allows us to look only towards the future while not looking towards the past. The counter notion of time I will seek to present on the basis of Indigenous philosophies is called spiraling time. And I'll talk a little bit about this, even though I may not have as much time to go into the details of that. And then on the basis of that, I want to present a concept of intergenerational ethics that I call asymmetrical reciprocity. So that's in the second section. I want to discuss asymmetrical reciprocity as sitting on top of or being an elaboration of spiraling time. And then I want to suggest why or how asymmetrical reciprocity can help us address the problem of just transition. So that's in the last section, so 3 sections. So Now, so in the first section, then, I will examine indigenous critiques of the notion of the Anthropocene and associated climate horror scenarios. For many indigenous authors, problems with standard Anthropocene narratives include: one, assuming that indigenous communities have been gradually deteriorating to the point that today's climate and environmental crisis threaten to kill them off permanently. Second, enclosing indigeneity in the Holocene epoch without consent by indigenous peoples themselves. And this kind of enclosure is often seen as denying the adaptability and historical change of indigenous peoples themselves, right? As if they were ahistorical peoples, right? They don't change over time. That is rejected by indigenous peoples. Third, assuming that indigenous peoples are pure, untouched by colonialism and so on, so kind of romanticization of indigenous peoples. And most importantly, for my purposes today, what indigenous peoples also reject is the overlooking that for many indigenous peoples, the apocalypse already happened in the past and continues in the present. So that it's not just a question of the feared consequences of climate change in the future, but that there is a recognition that, as it were, colonialism already happened in the past and is not just an issue for the future. So the description of our time as haunted by a dystopian future of climate disaster is contested by indigenous peoples on the basis of its forgetting of the past and present, as well as for its very use of a linear conception of time, which first of all permits the divorce of the present from putatively non-present times, namely past and future. As such, the overall claim is that narratives of natural disaster tend to marginalize or erase the experience of some populations, particularly indigenous people, who have already been subjected to violent transformations of their way of life induced by colonial violence. As indigenous authors such as Potawatomi scholar activist Kyle White have pointed out, the consequences of colonialism for indigenous populations are in some ways similar to the apocalyptic consequences feared with respect to climate change, which include forced removal from the land, loss of meaningful reciprocities, and that's going to be important, of course, reciprocities, with animals, plants, and the land, as well as loss of agency and self-determination, right? These are some of the consequences that we fear with respect to climate change, but they have already happened to many indigenous peoples as a result of colonialism. So rather than a disaster looming on the horizon, these consequences articulate the actuality of the colonial past and present for indigenous populations. Thus, rather than sharing in the projection of an apocalyptic future, indigenous perspectives on climate change situate the present time as already dystopian. In other words, fearing for the future of humanity at large, as the very notion of the Anthropocene would suggest, tends to forget the violence of the past and the present, and thereby betrays an illegitimate marginalization of the indigenous experience. Developing a theory of intergenerational justice for future people that is not mindful of the violent history of colonialism thus betrays a limited perspective unconcerned with marginalized peoples and indigenous populations. In its anthropic universality, the notion of the Anthropocene equally fails to connect the violence of colonialism to the present ecological crises. In recent years, authors such as Ian Bochum, Olufemi Otaiwo, Catherine Yusuf have related the climate crisis to the history of slavery as well as the history of colonialism. For these reasons, climate change is inseparable from the breaking of what many indigenous people call kin relations of reciprocity, trust, accountability, and consent among populations that are affected differently by colonial history, and in the present by ongoing marginalization and environmental change. Indigenous peoples have often understood themselves as responding to environmental changes with renewed and transformative kin relations. Thus, for White, for example, we should not only speak of climate tipping points, but also of relational tipping points, right? So there are climate tipping points, but there are also relational tipping points that settler-colonial states have been unwilling or unable to address. What are relational tipping points? You can fill them with content, relations of reciprocity, trust, cooperation, and so on. Right? And those have been broken. And so addressing climate change simply by focusing on climate tipping points is seen as dangerous because it neglects the fact that there are also these relational tipping points which are deeply affected by the history of colonialism. Right. So I think I already discussed this. I'll leave it there for a moment. So in contrast to the erasure of colonial and indigenous histories, indigenous approaches to climate change are often motivated. So now we're moving into sort of more positive territory. You know, so far we discussed what they reject, and now what motivates them. Namely, indigenous approaches to climate change are often motivated by dialogical narratives between descendants and ancestors. White suggests such dialogue relies on what he, reviewing various indigenous accounts and following discussions with several indigenous scholars and elders, calls spiraling time. The more work I do on indigenous philosophies, the more I encounter from various parts of the world the notion of spiraling time, and maybe we can talk more about it. This is my next slide, in fact. So this is the discussion of understanding the present as part of a spiraling time rather than linear time, right? For Stuart Harawiri, for example, a Maori scholar, the notion of spiraling time, which also includes the non-separation of time and space, of history and land, is not an ahistorical account of time, but much needed today to situate ourselves in this ecological crisis. I'm not going to read the citation on the screen there. So centrally, spiraling time, which for Stuart Harawiri is also inspired by Heidegger's and Gadamer's hermeneutic circle, connects the present in its opening on the future to both past generations and the land. So you have kind of a dual reciprocity there, and you'll see I try to develop this into the notion of asymmetrical reciprocity in the second section. So what's the duality? The duality is that there is reciprocity of the generations, but also reciprocity with the land, with the environment, if you wish. Environment, of course, is not an unproblematic term. So we will come back to the spiral's co-implication of past, present, and future, as well as of time and space in a moment. In fact, Stuart Harawiri speaks of this double implication as best represented by the Maori double spiral. So if that interests you, the Maori actually have not a single spiral, but a double spiral that sort of they intersect two spirals. So you can Google this if you like and look up some of these images that are very, very widespread, and you can find them easily, I think. So much could be said here, and indeed, I'd like to learn more about spiraling time. As a philosopher who's written quite a bit about time, this is new territory for me, fascinating territory. But for now, let me note that the spiral denotes neither cyclical nor linear time. The opposition between these two, cyclical and linear time, has in fact often been used in the West to assert its superiority. The Eurocentric and logocentric vision of a people of linear history relegating others, other cultures, to mere mythos in cyclical return of the ever same. This is a frequent topos in the history of Western philosophy, right? The opposition between logos and mythos, and logos is associated with the creation of something new, with the building of a history of a people, and that separates itself from nature, when nature is understood as cyclical, right? So when you view a people like indigenous peoples as belonging to cyclical time, then they're really merely natural people, like we speak of Naturvölker, natural peoples. But there often is then the association that they belong to a cyclical time, right? They don't have a history. And we already heard that many indigenous peoples reject that, the idea that basically they haven't developed over the last 10,000 years, right? This kind of romanticization. And the interesting point here is that spiraling time is neither linear nor cyclical, right? And that's really all I think I'm going to say about spiraling time here. Right? Yeah, so I think that's where I wanted to be at this point. Skipping a bit more. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. Now I want to come back to from spiraling time to some of the questions that animate this discussion, namely sustainability, questions around sustainability, understood in terms of intergenerational ethics, justice between generations. So spiraling time is a time that gives rise to what Kai White calls intergenerational dialogue, right? The dialogue is one between ancestors and descendants at the same time. But it's not just a dialogue that you may or may not engage in. Many indigenous philosophers would say, no, it is a kind of dialogue that sustains us, right? The teachings of our ancestors make us who we are. And so taking up these teachings is not just something that you may or may not do. It is something that, in fact, is our very lifeblood. It is the way that we are in the world. But then what can we say about the content of this dialogue? What will be talked about in the intergenerational dialogue that is inspired by spiraling time? The conception of intergenerational dialogue leads White and others to pose two key and interrelated questions. And now you see the quite well-known language of the gift emerge. First, in the words of Robin Wall Kimmerer, how do we return the gifts from our ancestors? Right? In having received gifts from the past, what do we owe? And second, how are we to become good ancestors ourselves? Note that these two formulations do not divorce the issue of relations with the past from relations with future people. Having received gifts from ancestors, the question is how we can be good ancestors ourselves in returning the favor by passing it forward. That's a nice expression in English, passing it forward. I'm not quite sure how you do this in German, but if you have ideas, let me know. So in asking these questions, it becomes clear that for White and others, the notion of dialogue among generations is inseparable from intergenerational obligations, revolving around the notion of the gift. The presently living are asked at the same time to look forward and backward in time, and thus to see themselves as receiving a gift, however modified, that will and should be passed on to future generations. In section 2, I will seek to capture this normative inseparability of past and future by proposing the notion of asymmetrical reciprocity among generations. So under the heading of reciprocity, we see that gifts and responsibilities are two sides of the same coin. The reception of a gift is coupled with a duty to use it for the benefit of all. This thinking of reciprocity, particularly with the earth, is similarly found in Glenshorn Coulthard's well-known book, Red Skin, White Masks, in which he proposes a grounded normativity, that's his term, in contrast to the politics of recognition that defines the Canadian settler-colonial state. This notion of grounded normativity or place-based ethics directly contests the drive for accumulation and capitalist expansion that has determined the history of, in this case, Canadian Indigenous relations. I have here a longer citation on which Coulthard draws from the Dini elder Philip Blake. I'm not going to read it, but you can do so yourself if you want. But in these teachings from Kimmerer and Blake, both of whom use the language of the gift received from ancestors and owed to descendants. So in these teachings, we can identify, again, a dual conception of reciprocity, both with the land or the earth, as well as with ancestors and descendants. Right? The gift of land is seen as constitutive of the humans living on and from it. As Coulthard says, land is here identity. Right? So it's not just a resource, land is identity here. So I want to develop this a little bit more in the second section by talking about what elsewhere I've discussed as asymmetrical reciprocity. So I believe the notion of reciprocity in question can be expressed to some extent by what I have sought to develop elsewhere as asymmetrical reciprocity. Elsewhere, I've also drawn in part on indigenous sources for this, largely mediated by the anthropologist Marcel Mauss, who in 1921 published this famous essay, Essai sur le don, in which he developed the notion of the gift based on indigenous anthropological literature that was available to him at the time. Let me begin by seeking to explain what I mean by asymmetry. So now it gets a little bit into this notion of asymmetrical reciprocity, which is also the development of the notion of the gift, if you want. First, I mean by asymmetry, in asymmetrical reciprocity, the power asymmetry between the present and the future, right? So this is a well-known topic in questions around sustainability, that the present has power over the future that the future doesn't have over the present. That's not to say that the future has no power, but it has clearly less power. There's an asymmetry of power, and that's what I seek to capture by talking about asymmetrical reciprocity. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly, asymmetry implies an indirect relation of reciprocity. So normally when we speak of reciprocity, we mean something like, I give you something, you give it back to me, right? So then you have only two parties to the reciprocity relation, and it is what underlies economic relations on the market, exchange relations, and so on. Right? And what's characteristic of these exchange relations typically is that once you get what you want and I get what I want, we can go our separate ways. Right? Now we may have a long-term relationship, but because we keep on exchanging, but that's contingent, right? That's contingent on our needs and our interests and so on. But indirect reciprocity is different. It is a three-party relation. So I give you something, but you give it to somebody else, not back to me. So it's still a kind of reciprocity, but it is a reciprocity that connects more than two people, and it connects them over a longer period of time. There are some economists that have developed this on the basis of Marcel Mauss again, some French and Belgian economists, and I draw partly on them, Arundel and Masson, but I can't go into the details here. But you can see that is a notion that is much richer than the exchange relation, in that it involves three parties. You see this, for example, also in Robin Wall-Kimmerer, on whom Kai White draws when he talks about the gift. So Robin Wall-Kimmerer, for example, speaks, says that she talks about a landscape of gifts, and she talks about a landscape gift economy. Right? And I think that the notion of reciprocity that she talks about is one that is indirect in this way. So, for example, she writes in her famous book, Braiding Sweetgrass, many of our, this is Wall-Kimmerer now, many of our ancient teachings counsel that whatever we have been given is supposed to be given away again. Right? But it's not to say I have to give it back to where I got it from. Right? That's not what's meant. In addition to power imbalance and the indirectness of giving, asymmetry implies two other key aspects. And this is now you have under on the slide under this co-constitutive nature of the gift in question. So asymmetry attempts to capture the constitutive nature of the gift, which is to say that the gift stands in a relation of dissymmetry to the recipients. It is not as cannot be seen as a mere object that the recipient may or may not accept. Rather, as we have seen above with the land received from ancestors, the gift received from A is co-constitutive of B in B's very being. Right? The land, we could add things like languages, cultures, traditions, and so on to this, is identity forming in a cultural sense that is inseparable from the material dependency on natural systems. Right? So it's not something that you can either take or not take. It's not something you can simply receive, but also you could refuse it in its entirety. No, it is co-constitutive of you as recipient. Right? It makes us who we are. As it determines intergenerational relations, this implies that the people in the present are co-constituted by the reception of the gift from the past. They would not be what they are without the gifts in question. And this constitutive nature brings us to the fourth and final aspect of asymmetry in asymmetrical reciprocity, namely the fact that the gift cannot be appropriated completely. Right? You remain in asymmetry as a recipient, you remain in asymmetry with a gift in the sense that you can't just wholly own it. You can't just wholly consume it like you might, with a cake or something. So it's not like food. You could totally appropriate. But even there with food, you can say, food cannot be appropriated completely, right? There's always a waste product, right? So which is quite significant, in fact. And so there too, you might say, no, there's a certain kind of asymmetry. What we assimilate, we can't assimilate completely, right? I think that's very important. And that's what I'm trying to also capture with the notion of asymmetry or in asymmetrical reciprocity. So land, languages, traditions and customs and so on cannot be appropriated in the way consumables are, but will always remain in access of the recipient. This inappropriable access is the condition of the appropriation of the past by the present, as well as the opening and linkage of the appropriators towards the future. So this asymmetry means that we remain open to the past and the future. So it is, in that sense, also co-constitutive in that we are part of a generational change, whether we like it or not. And the asymmetry seeks to capture that by indicating this openness. It's not something you can take and refuse or assimilate completely. It's something that constitutes us in such a way that we are temporal beings, generational beings that are open to past and future in this way. Right? You can see this, for example, in the fact that that which cannot be appropriated completely has to be passed on to the future. And so asymmetrical reciprocity seeks to capture that aspect. Nature, the earth, the land is not something that we can consume in its entirety, but it's something we must pass on to the future, right? And that's what asymmetry seeks to capture, something we have to pass on to the future. And then you can ask the question, yeah, what are better and worse ways of passing it on to the future? Right? So asymmetrical reciprocity is sort of the baseline of normativity, of this intergenerational normativity here, but it requires that we think reciprocity, not just among generations, but also with the land, the environment, and so on, right? So this returns us to a previous discussion of spiraling time, for the gift of the past always calls to us from the future, and in this way obliges us to pass on the gift. Right? Now you can talk a little bit more about this with Marcel Mauss, but I'm going to skip that in the interest of time because I want to get to my concluding section. How am I doing in terms of time?
30 minutes, close, almost.
Okay, perfect. That's good. If I can, get to my conclusions there. I have 4 conclusions in my last section, and I'm not sure, 5 to 7 minutes maybe or so. So I'm just going to skip the discussion of Mauss, and I'm going to move on to the final section. So in this section, I'd like to address how this notion of asymmetrical reciprocity, of which, of course, I've only given you a sketch, can aid in the task of demarginalizing the future. So, but before that, I'd like to address a worry about cultural extractivism. Do I already have this? No. Yeah, I'll get to this. Sorry, I'm not quite sure what's the right one. I think it's this one. Yeah, it's this one. Cultural extractivism is the worry whether asymmetrical reciprocity ought to be proposed for a global humanity. Not being an indigenous scholar myself, there is a legitimate worry that the appropriation of ideas from indigenous culture, placing them in the marketplace of ideas, so to speak, operates under the same logic of extraction that dispossessed native peoples of their ancestral land. Thus, perhaps cultural extractivism follows on the heels of resource extractivism. This is a potential objection to which a lot could be said, but the basic idea of the objection is to say, so non-indigenous peoples largely dispossessed indigenous peoples of their lands. Then they did bad things with the land such that it's now in a degraded state. We have climate change, we have environmental degradation and so on. And now we are at a time when non-indigenous peoples turn to indigenous people, now give us your ideas as to how to manage the land, right? So you have cultural extractivism following on the heels of resource extractivism. And in response to these worries about extractivism and a lack of trust in reciprocity, which I referenced briefly earlier when I talked with Kai White about relational tipping points. So in response to these worries, I'd like to first highlight that not all accounts of asymmetrical reciprocity are drawn from indigenous sources in the strict sense. For example, Marcel Mauss draws on early Germanic as well as Roman traditions. Indirect intergenerational reciprocity has been proposed by Western philosophers as well, with passing reference to Mauss in some cases, which often, though, don't mention Mauss's indigenous sources. And that's, of course, significant, right? And a problem. Second, as cited above in the case of Dini Elder, Philip Blake, some indigenous scholars themselves universalize this point. For it is intergenerational land-based reciprocity that Philip Blake and others propose as a future system of values for our world. Similarly, Stuart Harawiri hopes that, far from being irrelevant in the modern world, traditional indigenous social, political, and cosmological ontologies are profoundly important to the development of transformative alternative frameworks for a global order. That was the citation from Stuart Harawiri. But above all, in my conclusion, I want to stress a third key point. The notion of asymmetrical reciprocity avoids constraining the sense of the future to a future that would be the same for all. In other words, asymmetrical reciprocity forestalls precisely the view that humanity is sufficiently unified or non-problematically unified so that we could simply speak of it facing a common future. Rather, this notion of intergenerational reciprocity differentiates relations to the ancestral past. If this is right, then asymmetrical reciprocity provides a model for demarginalizing the future by taking into account the differentiation of the past as the condition for the present. For example, in the indigenous context, the past and ongoing violence of colonialism shapes the possibilities of indigeneity in the future. Conversely, and without wishing to acquaint harms here, the history of colonialism, while bestowing many benefits on beneficiaries, can also be seen to impoverish possibilities for settlers and settler descendants, for instance, by encouraging an understanding of co-constitutive land as property and relations with others as primarily economic transactions by an atomistic self. Thus, we must remember the past, but remember it in multiple forms to make sense of differentiated horizons of possibility. Furthermore, I think the social ontology of asymmetrical reciprocity deepens the point that the relation to the future is inseparable, both ontologically and normatively, from relations with the past. The overall idea then is that because the very definition of indigenous peoples, for example, in various UN declarations, but also the definition put forward by White and others, includes reference to colonial dispossession. Because that is so, right? So the UN definition of indigenous peoples includes colonial dispossession. The possibility of respectfully learning from indigenous peoples requires grasping the processes that rob them of their lands and aiding in the struggle for their self-determination and return of stolen lands in the future. In this sense, the conditions under which non-indigenous peoples could legitimately inherit the gifts of indigenous teachings include resistance to ongoing colonialism, both because of the inherent wrong of colonial violence and land theft, and because intergenerational reciprocity and associated liabilities demand this resistance. Such resistance includes the need to build the capacity to receive the gift, right? Which is not just a cognitive effort, but part of an alternative world building more broadly. Crucially, however, it is precisely in the recognition of the strong connection between the future and the differentiated past that the notion of asymmetrical reciprocity can indeed become a common reference point and so recommend itself to us all. Right, so there are then four ways in which asymmetrical reciprocity helps to differentiate the past and demarginalize the future. And I'm going to go pretty quickly to the next slide, if that's okay with you, because there you get an overview of this conclusion that I said has sort of four parts to it. There are then four ways in which asymmetrical reciprocity helps to differentiate the past and demarginalize the future. The first, which we just discussed, constitutively links the future to the past and so calls for vigilance regarding inherited wrongs and their associated prejudices. So one advantage of asymmetrical reciprocity is that this complex account of relations between the generations and with the land necessarily and always takes the past into consideration. There could be no relation to the future that would not take account of the specificities of the past in the very grasping of what time itself is, right? So for example, spiraling time. And the specific, and thereby the specific past of histories of oppression, dispossession, and colonization. On this view, in seeking to demarginalize futures, we not only should consider the past, but must do so, as asymmetrical reciprocity and the gift are constitutive of being and identity in the present. Further, as the longer version showed, Mauss argues asymmetrical reciprocity implies that the very source of the normative lies in intergenerational relations. As moral agents, we are necessarily born mortals, born of previous generations and dying to leave the world to others after us. So that was the first part of the conclusion. The second advantage, I think that's already my next slide. The second advantage of asymmetrical reciprocity is that against the sort of presentist phantasm that pretends that we are self-standing, self-birthing individuals, as if we gave birth to ourselves, against this sort of presentist phantasm, and against a merely forward-looking account based in linear time, asymmetrical reciprocity calls attention to the fact that we are always passing on an inherited life world, and with that, taken for granted background assumptions, traditions, languages, socioeconomic structures, and so on. So, for example, simply by speaking English here, we are contributing to its global hegemony. So the idea here is that asymmetrical reciprocity just shows that whenever we are looking towards the future, we are also carrying with us not only the land, but languages, traditions, and so on. And it thereby alerts us to the fact that we might want to look very carefully at what it is that we're passing on. There may be histories of oppression that are embedded in the kinds of assumptions, languages, cultures, and so on that we're passing on. Right, and I see that as the second advantage of asymmetrical reciprocity, because it just doesn't allow us to merely look towards the future. That was the second one. Now the third, as discussed above, one might think that the gift is only ever a benefit, at least on balance, and not a harm, and thus it would be wrong or even perverse to apply this notion, asymmetrical reciprocity, colonialism, that is to speak of inherited gifts with deep historical harm. In other words, the mere application of the gift to this legacy would only privilege the victors of history once more, to borrow a phrase from Walter Benjamin. Now, however, one may find that the notion of intergenerationality implied by the gift is useful for undermining the denial of the inherited past. For example, White discusses how would-be non-Indigenous allies of Indigenous peoples tend to believe that they are innocent, free of any culpability that would stem from their own ancestors. By forgetting their ancestral fantasies, the hopes for the future of their, for example, settler ancestors, these allies tend to deny the violent gifts they have received from their ancestors, who colonized, oppressed, displaced, and murdered Indigenous peoples. Right. So, White, in a very interesting and fascinating section, not only says that this notion of the gift is something that we claim as Indigenous peoples as part of our intergenerational teachings, but also says that in addressing what he calls allies who think that they're innocent but want to help Indigenous peoples survive and deal with their challenges and so on. What they should do is themselves engage in intergenerational dialogue with their ancestors. And what they would then recognize is that they are in fact living the dream of their ancestors, namely the situation in which Indigenous peoples are very marginalized, no longer have control of the land, and are often pushed off into reserves and less fertile lands and so on, and have very little self-determination, right? And so the notion of the gift and this intergenerational dialogue is recommended by White and others also for non-Indigenous people who think that they are, in some sense, innocent of the past, right? So just engage in your own dialogue is the recommendation there, I think. So I call this with Alexis Shotwell claiming back kin, right? As the dialogue is counterfactual, moreover, it could suggest now for these would-be allies, for non-Indigenous peoples, it could suggest alternative possibilities in the past for the future. Such, I call this a repotentialization of the past, which may, however, neither claim innocence nor disavow the colonial past in the name of a common future. right? So that was my third point. And now my final point, this is again about this allyship. He calls this the allyship of innocence, right? So to pretend that one is an innocent ally again requires that one reject the past and say, in the future, we're going to help. Okay, so this is the last point then. This allows us to transition to my fourth and final point, which is how asymmetrical reciprocity supports the argument for what I call liability for compensation. Now, reciprocity duties are often given in the form of equivalence. So once you accept that asymmetrical reciprocity is the way, so it's an ontological point, is the way in which we relate with the land and with non-present generations, past generations and future generations, the question might arise, so what is the moral content of reciprocity duties, right? And one way, and really only one way in order to fill this with content would be to say it is given in terms of equivalence. Often economists would say you must pass it forward in at least as good a condition as you received it, right? So this is what I call it equivalence. Right? So you saw this, for example, in Philip Blake, the long citation on the slide earlier that I did not read, in the notion of passing on the land in the same or as good a condition as it was received from the ancestors, right? And Philip Blake says, well, we didn't degrade it, but we also didn't necessarily try to improve it, right? Now, one may rightly wonder if that is the normative content of the notion of reciprocity, what if the inheritance is received in a degraded state? So, for example, in the context of climate change, right? The climate is inherited in a state that is already suffering. Right? In response to this, it is important to differentiate the cause of the degradation so that one can see how a present generation could come under an obligation, not just to pass it on as it was received, but to improve the inheritance, right? So to give you an example, if a previous user damages a bicycle by overuse, perhaps by delivering newspapers, and then passes on both the damaged bike and the profits from delivering newspapers or whatever, then all other things being equal, I would say the subsequent user should use the inherited profits to fix the damage for the sake of a third party that then receives the bicycle, right? This kind of argument is transferable, I believe, to the role of improving environments when it comes to climate change. Arguably, this is indeed the situation in which the current generation of the developed world finds itself in. Having inherited the benefits of industrialization and colonization, beneficiaries above all must now compensate for the associated climate damages and environmental and racial injustices. This raises the question of what compensation might mean for indigenous peoples, a question that could hardly be addressed in the absence of dialogue. Given the central role of land in indigenous resistance to colonialism, given the central role of indigenous continuance and survivance, those are terms that indigenous peoples often use, and given the central role of indigenous accounts of intergenerational relationality, it is clear there can be no decolonization without rematriation of land. My overall point here was that asymmetrical reciprocity and the gift drawn from indigenous philosophies themselves call for the recognition of and resistance to the bloody history of violence, in response to which we seek to demarginalize visions of the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthias, for this really fascinating talk. And before we go on to the discussion, I would like to introduce David, my ISS colleague, David Löw-Behr. Maybe that's a bit too. So David works in the ISS project, Regional Sustainability Transformations, and we previously worked together in a project on politicizing the future. That's why we share this interest in intergenerational justice and the future, all kinds of research on the future, of course. And yeah, David will be shortly commenting the presentation and will also lead the moderation now. So I hand over to you, David.
Thank you, Enrique, and thank you, Matthias, for your talk. And I also already saw that there are some questions already in the chat, so we will go, I think, afterwards directly to them. I thought it was a lot of very, very interesting and helpful concepts that you presented. The idea of spiraling time, I think, is really fascinating. And for me, yeah, who has some background in economics, it's also quite a good way of sort of trying to put together this wrong idea in economics of linear time, and also the difficult thing of cyclical time. Should we switch to, yeah. Geht das?
Das geht.
Oh. So I think this is helpful, and the idea of asymmetrical reciprocity is also quite interesting, because, and also helpful because of the responsibility for future generations. Even though I was a little bit even confused that you said that the future has some power, because in my view it has really little power to do that. It might be even less power than, let's say, a small child has, who can at least scream or yeah, be present, even though his wishes might not be accepted or looked at. So I'm not a philosopher. So what I can do and try to do is yeah, ask maybe one a bit naive question, and yeah, the things that us as social scientists, of course, are interested in. Is it helpful and convincing for our problems? The suggestions that you made. So the one thing that I still think about a lot is the term gifts that you brought up. So one thing I wonder about is who is giving. Whose gift do I get as a person who is living today? Is it sort of a mixture of something personal, I as a sort of yeah, just looking at sort of my ancestors, and a mixture of me being German, white man, whatever, and me being part of humanity that sort of gets whatever a certain degradation of the world, or a certain wealth. So yeah, and that sort of is important to me, because gift sounds like something. I mean, you, in the end of your talk, you mentioned also the gifts that are sort of problematic, colonialism. We could also say the burdens of destruction of I call it the environment now. So it sounds a little bit difficult for me, this term gift, and why not use a term like responsibility for humanity or something like that, just to make sure, of course, we are in this continuity of past generations and future generations, but why do we need this term of gift, and why is it helpful? And then sort of the second part that I was wondering about, the questions of, is it convincing or helpful? And maybe I was thinking, yeah, to start it a bit provocative and personal. So as a parent, if I take this notion as sort of an ideal for my son, would it be that I would want my son to feel that he is gifted to live the life that he's living, and therefore is responsible to clean up all the mess that I and my ancestors have left to him? So is it that way, or all the donors to stay in this gift term? Is it in that way helpful? And the other thing I was wondering about, as I told you before, we have been working on Lusatia, so a coal mining region close by in the last years, and I was thinking, when we tried to talk to people there that aren't really convinced that they should now contribute so heavily to working against climate change, to coal exit and all of these things, how would your concepts resonate with them? And the one thing I thought, it would be sort of great, because what they feel is they get some money now, but they lack sort of a recognition of what they have achieved in terms of wealth, in terms of energy security, and all of these things for people. So they would sort of, I think, like that idea in that. The other thing that I was thinking, it might be helpful because they because it might open up the dialogue on the question of how do we look at the past? So, do we also look? I mean, we look at the past from today, knowing that coal mining has these negative consequences, and of course, at the time it was done in, let's say, in the 60s or 70s, and of course it's still done now, but in the 60s or 70s, people didn't know that it has this negative consequences, and it might sort of your concepts might help to open some dialogue there. But at the same time, what they often say is we are not acknowledged for having contributed so much to all the wealth that all people in at least Germany or have enjoyed in the past. We are the ones who suffered. So basically what they are saying is you're living in big cities, you can enjoy your, whatever today, your smartphones, and we are the ones who really suffered. We had the negative consequences in many ways. We had the tough jobs, and we had the natural disasters. We had our villages moved away, and yeah, now we are, in addition to all of that, blamed to be the bad people who destroyed nature. And I think to move that a little bit, or to generalize that a little bit, I also wonder how your ideas are related to all of the questions of intragenerational justice. So the things that you said are of course true, but people might say, what does that mean for me as not being a person who is privileged or rich enough to really give away? And to use your last term or your last example of the bicycle and the benefits, and to sort of spend them, if you feel you need to spend these things on essential things, then you can't save them to save sort of humanity or nature. Yeah, maybe we can start there, and maybe you can help me with my dialogues.
Yeah, sure. So do I wait now for the camera to turn towards me, or you? No, you do. This is not like the owl that does it automatically, right? Yeah, thank you so much for those challenging questions, and I'm not sure I have a good answer to all of them. So I think your second and your third question about the gift, the language of the gift, why not speak of responsibility instead, and who do I get the gift from? I'm going to take this question first. So you offered me 3 possible answers, and I think that's helpful. So who do I get the gift from? Is it personal, my parents and so on, or is it something I get as a white German male? So is it something that is you would situate at the level mostly of nationality, or is it something that I get simply as a member of humanity, so at a higher level? And I think the notion of the gift is supposed to indicate the way in which these levels are precisely related to one another. So, I mean, I love baking bread. In the bread I make is the flour. That's tens of thousands of years in the making, cultivation of different kinds of, certainly not only local people, but Mesopotamia, ancient Egyptian cultures, and so on. Long histories of cultivation of wheat and other grains, but there's also there's a culture in that, a culture of baking. My father was a baker. I learned it from my dad to some extent, but he of course learned it from other people before him, and at some point it becomes untraceable, right? So it is personal, but it is also at the level of cultures, but it's also then at the level of humanity, and it's also the land that contributed to this, right? So it needs for the flower you need the sun, and you need water, and you need soil, you need the land, and so And so in that sense, the gift precisely wants to say, when you want to pin it down, so who did I get something from? Like, who helped me be the kind of person I am today and allow me to live, to speak, to be a competent person, make my way in the world and so on. Well, then, you may say, well, you start with your parents, but you quickly see that, oh, there are all kinds of traces of a contribution that at some point are maybe untraceable is too quick, as it were, but at some point you get in all kinds of directions, such that there's something there that we received that isn't pinpointable. You can just say, well, it was just that, right? Or it was just my mother, or it was just my uncle, or whatever. So I think that is. That's precisely what the gift is meant to indicate. And that's partly what I mean by this inappropriability. I think this is very much part of an indigenous thinking of the gift, and why the language, I think, is useful, as long as you don't restrict it to sort of Christmas gifts or birthday gifts. You see it in a broader context. Namely that whenever you receive something that is connected in myriad ways with land and ancestors in ways that render the gift not fully appropriate, not fully measurable, not fully capable of saying, it generates an obligation, but only to this much, only to this point. So I think that is my first response. And then why is this important when, how would you render this concept of the gift or of asymmetrical reciprocity useful in discussions with people in coal mining regions and people who now are asked to make sacrifices for the energy transition and so on. I think you can address a problem such as climate change and just transition, first of all, under the heading of what exactly is justice and who owes what to whom. Sort of the standard question of moral and political philosophy is that, right? Who owes what to whom, right? And the what is how much, right, is built into that. And there's a ton of literature on that, but I think asymmetrical reciprocity is situated at a slightly different level, and is situated at the level of self-understanding and moral motivation and so on. So that the first task, I think, what we can learn from indigenous people is the first task is to resituate ourselves, to ask ourselves who we are, where we come from, and what have we received, and what do we owe forward. And in that sense, it is not separate from the language of the gift, and reciprocity is not separate from the language of responsibility, right? The notion of the gift is precisely the very source of normativity, of responsibility, of obligation, and so on. But it requires a sort of a resituating. It requires a rethinking of who we are. Right? As the feminist climate ethicist. I often say it's a question of who do we think we are, and I think that's exactly right. Who do we think we are? That is the first question. What exactly do I owe for what reason to whom? I think that's not the first question at this juncture. The question is, who are we? Right, and this is where asymmetrical reciprocity comes in. But it does address the question of what exactly we owe to some extent. And I get to this when I talk about equivalence and the bicycle example, liability for compensation and so on. And there I would say, when you say, well, what about people who have already made a lot of sacrifices and now are asked to make even more sacrifices for the sake of future generations? Well, in a way, that is the starting point of this discussion of indigenous peoples and climate politics. And that's in a way the question they ask, right? I think the bicycle example was supposed to capture the way in which asymmetrical reciprocity can be linked to an argument that precisely puts the burden of addressing climate change, mitigation, of course, mitigation, but also adaptation, and then what today is called loss and damage and used to be called compensation. Right? It's actually an interesting story why it's no longer called compensation. Lays the burden for that at the feet of the industrialized global north, in the way that this kind of argument suggests. I think I'm going to leave it at that for now. Maybe there's time to address some of your other points because there were many, but maybe it's a good idea to take another question.
Sorry. I haven't looked around very much, but I haven't seen a question from here, but I saw that there's a question in chat, and maybe the people that are in the chat, you can also tell us if we are not loud enough, then write that down to us, and then we try to switch microphones. But Alexander, do you want to put it yourself?
Yeah, there's one written question in the chat and 2 people raised their hands. We now have almost 30 participants virtually. So Dr. Kunkowski, who wrote the question, would you like to read it out, or shall I do it? And while we wait for the answer, maybe we can already have the first person asking it directly, which would be Elias König.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you so much for the talk. It was really interesting. I think it's really good to have these conversations at ESS. And my question is about the notion of spiraling time. I think this is a very fascinating concept, and I always wonder, what does it concretely mean in relation to the climate crisis? So one thing that I've been recently thinking about, and I wonder what you think about it, is, and a lot of people have brought this up, is the Little Ice Age. So the previous big climate crisis in the global Earth system, at least particularly if you're in Europe, but as I understand also in other parts of the world, which if you ask some scientists was already partly human caused. So out of the 0.5 to 1 degree drop that you saw in the long 17th century, like I think 0.1 degree, according to some scientists, was due to the genocide in the Americas and the landscape changes that followed from that. And so Amitav Ghosh and others have sort of argued that in thinking about this climate crisis, it's really, really important to go back to the last climate crisis and to, think about it not as a new thing, but as also as a climate crisis that has predecessors, which I thought is interesting. I wonder what you think about that, and if there are other sort of interesting uses of the concept of spiraling time when it comes to the climate crisis. Yeah, I'd be curious to know about that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Elias, for your question. Yeah, the Orbis spike dip is, I think, what it's called, right? I think what Carl White would probably say is that it indicates that there's no reason to romanticize indigenous peoples, enclose them in the Holocene, and so on, right? Because the Orbis spike dip is a result of genocide in the North Americas, but also, of course, disease that came with European settlers and so on. But that gave us that dip in CO2 concentrations, in part because indigenous peoples were already engaged in widespread use of the land. Right? So there's no point in saying, well, they were totally part of cyclical time and they lived in harmony with nature, and there was no climate change as a result of indigenous activities. That's wrong. And indigenous people would say, well, it also shows you that there is no reason to suggest that indigenous peoples were simply ahistorical peoples, right? And so there's already a history that you have to acknowledge, and hence the opposition between linear and cyclical time doesn't work. And one way to come up with something else, that if neither of these is acceptable, is spiraling time. Of course, philosophically, the spiral is still a line, and there are good reasons to think that time is also discontinuous and not just continuous, and the line seems to suggest that there's simply continuity along the line, as if you could trace time along the spiral. That I think is, you get to a point where that's not quite so helpful. Maybe things get a lot more complicated when you have a double spiral, so two intersecting spirals. But the second spiral is typically, from what I've read, interpreted by indigenous peoples to represent reciprocities with the land. Right, so that's how you get this complex interaction. Also in some Aztec philosophies, you find the spiral. And so a lot more would have to be said about the spiral and the linearity that it still suggests, but you get the idea. To relate to the future, you also necessarily, whether you like it or not, you relate to the past, because that is what time is, not something you should do. It is something that you do, right? So you always bring in the past when you are addressing the future. And similarly, when you are addressing the past, you're thinking about the past, you're thinking about the history of colonialism, you are thereby projecting, inadvertently, perhaps unconsciously, you are projecting visions of the future, what the future could possibly be, which is why at some point I talked about repotentialization of the past. And that is, I think, the value of the spiral, of spiraling time. Thank you for your question.
Okay, so I will now read out the question from the chat, which was made by Dr. Punkowski, TUM. It's just one. Okay. It says, a question for the discussion. Since right and wrong, especially in regard to long-term activities concerned with the environment, seem to be highly subjective, for example, investing in green energy production or creating jobs in green industry, and there always seems to be someone arguing that the strategies of capitalist societies and politics are in favor of everyone, how can we start to distinguish here and find universal arguments for real justice and solidarity with everyone? It always seems that these great ideas, like asymmetrical reciprocity, are being stopped at the border of rational capitalism. Yeah, nice idea, but it doesn't create jobs or puts money on the table of people. How can we start to overcome that status quo thinking? How can we convince people that a radical new thinking about economy, society, and nature is necessary? Not looking for final answers, but maybe some exchange on ideas.
Yes. Yes. Thank you for that question. I'm certainly not a subjective relativist, so I don't think that all ideas of right and wrong are relative to individuals and their own viewpoints. Part of the reason why I think that is that because I think that we're all deeply influenced by traditions and languages and histories and so on that we're not fully aware of. So I think that there is no good basis for believing in subjective relativism. So the idea that anybody can say what is right or wrong, and there is really no rational basis to discuss what is right or wrong, I think that we can. My proposal here, again, is not primarily a substantive contribution to saying what is right or wrong, right? My contribution is primarily at the level of what you might call a social ontological normative ontology. I know that's a big mouthful, but an ontology is to say who we are. It's this notion of identity, of how we should understand ourselves. And this is, I think, where the notion of the gift or asymmetrical reciprocity comes in. It asks us to situate ourselves as embedded in intergenerational relations, as well as in the environment, the land, nature, the earth, and so on. So it asks us to rethink who we are. And then I think that this ontology is universal. So I think it's true for all human beings, and in fact, not just for human beings. Even though, of course, when we talk about intergenerational justice, we are primarily thinking in terms of ancestors and descendants who are human. There's a lot to be said if you have questions about animal ethics and plant ethics and so on. I'm happy to talk about that. But I do think it is universal, and it is a proposal on the basis of which, so universal proposal on the basis of which to ask further questions about right and wrong, but it is the basis of that. And it's not itself a substantive answer to what is right or what is wrong. So the liability for compensation argument on which I ended, for example, is a more of a substantive contribution taking off from the idea of equivalence as the content of reciprocity obligations. Similarly, I would say one of the advantages of, in fact, of asymmetrical reciprocity goes a little bit towards David's question also regarding the relationship between inter and intragenerational justice. Something interesting happens when you use the notion of asymmetrical reciprocity, namely that you have a third party, and the third party is it has not yet been party to the interaction, right? So there's always a question of who is the worthy recipient. I mean, if you have direct reciprocity, then it's clear who the participants are, right, and who the recipients are. I give you something, you owe it back to me on this exchange model. The indirect reciprocity model, you give me something, and now there's an open-ended question: who do I give it to? Could be that you are the most worthy recipient. Could be somebody else. And so all kinds of substantive questions as to the content of justice come into play at that point. And this is, could be that there are vulnerable populations in the present who are owed more or more urgently than future generations. That is in principle possible and not ruled out at all by asymmetrical reciprocity. I would say, however, that the notion of the gift goes along with the idea of preserving the conditions for gift giving in the first place, right? And so this has something to do with the alignment, boundary conditions, and so on. I've developed this elsewhere. And then what would I say on the basis of asymmetrical reciprocity, people who are saying, well, we need jobs and so on. I mean, there's of course the big question of just transition, right? And I think it's very, very important to combine intra and intergenerational justice. I don't need to play one off against the other. Of course, the energy transition must be a just one, and it shouldn't just shift jobs away from one sector to the other without any consideration for the people who are thereby losing their jobs in the fossil fuel industry, right? That, of course, and again, asymmetrical reciprocity is not at all opposed to that, I think, and that's my focus wasn't here on people affected by the energy transition with respect to their jobs. My focus was on indigenous peoples for the reasons stated in my preamble to the talk. But it's a similar question.
We have one more question in the chat, is that right? Or do we have more? Two more? And we have one here. Are there more questions? Because we're all right. So we have 4 more questions, and maybe we collect them because we are having like I think 7 more minutes. Alexandra, you one here before? Okay, so we switch around. Okay.
Okay. Should I turn this on? Is this maybe I can
turn it on
fast enough? Is it on?
Now it's on.
Okay, thank you very much, Matthias, for a very interesting talk. I have 2 kind of comments, questions. The first one is about time as well, which is that from my own experience with indigenous communities, what I've learned from them is that they think that they are simultaneous, the past, the present, and the future. And they say something that really kind of impacted my own thinking and realization, which is that thanks to the people before us, we get to sit on this chair, be in this building, because it was built by our ancestors. It was, the technology was developed. So everything in our lives is actually because of the past. So we live the past. So it's a very, very strong connection to the past. And as the past created the present creates the future. So again, very strong sense of responsibility, because everything we do today impacts or creates the future. So that I thought that was really interesting, and I just wondered about your kind of thoughts on how to relate that maybe to other concepts that you talked about. And then the other little quick point I wanted to make was about cultural extractivism, and how, yes, absolutely, that would be something to very much steer clear of. But at the same time, it's really that, indigenous peoples can remind us of our own indigenous past and of our own connection to nature, and to kind of maybe living the cycles of nature much more strongly than we do, even also as a response to the environmental challenges that we face today. So I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you.
John.
Yeah, you can hear me. I'll try and be succinct with the question that I have, but I'm most curious perhaps about delineating the differences between the past, present, and future generations. The first part of that being living and dead. Do we delineate the present generations as those currently living, and then the past as those who have passed already, and the future those who are yet to be born? Or are we considering differences within those who are still living? For example, like older generations, say the working class generation, and then teenagers and children. Because I feel like the role of agency is very important there. That's why I'm just curious about also the role of active agency. So if we're saying the present generation has a sort of obligation to manage the gift that was given by the past generations and pass it in a form onto the future generation, if they're all living at the same time, then the role of agency of, for example, the older generation that might still want to preserve the status quo for their own benefit in affecting then the present and future generations, or hindering their ability to preserve this gift, and wondering to what extent that plays into this theory.
Thank you. Alexander, more?
Yeah, there was one more question in the chat about why don't we include the concept of participation in the discussion? If indigenous people do not participate in political decisions, it will be difficult to generate instances of paradigm transformation. And Matilda has been raising their hand for quite a bit. So I would invite Matilda to very briefly ask the last question of today.
Yes, thank you very much. My question, first, thank you for this inspiring presentation. My main question refers to the point where you have been talking about how are we talking about negative gifts, so to speak, gifts that we have, like, I think currently in our society, we are used to giving privileged access to resources to people, to certain people, to resources that were stolen in the past and taken away by force. For example, in Germany, I think much of our society and our much of what we are living from is taken away from other people, and not rightfully so. And so my question would be, how would we get away from talking about this like a gift that we should give away, while keeping in mind that, or can we talk about things that we have gotten by force unrightfully as a gift, or should we rather talk about this like you said before, about about a dialogue, that we are talking, that we are getting input, or that we are talking to people from the past and we are saying this is not okay, we have to distance ourselves from that.
Thank you.
Matthias,
Yes.
you can answer them, and if you manage in 3 minutes, it would be great, but I know it was a lot of challenging questions.
Okay, I begin with you. Sorry, I didn't catch your name. Heike. Yes, thank you. Time. Simultaneity of past, present, and future as part of indigenous conceptions of time. I very much agree, and I try to get at this by saying that from what I understand, on the indigenous view, we are the ancestors of our descendants and the descendants of our ancestors. Right? And so now you would say, well, what does that mean? Well, it means that you're not privileging the present. You're not saying that, first I am, and then I am I inherited. There were others before me, and I know, yeah, there will be others after me. It's not like that, right? The notion of spiraling time suggests that you are always the ancestor of your descendant and the descendant of your ancestors, right? That is what the present is on spiraling time, right? The present is not one point that you can separate from past and future, but right? The being is one of belonging to a generational time that is at the same time connected to the land. Right? This is how I try to capture that. So I think we very much agree on that. Cultural extractivism and indigenous peoples can remind us of our own indigeneity. Yes, and there is some debate among indigenous philosophers themselves. So when it comes to definitions of indigenous peoples, Robin Wall Kimmerer, whose work I discussed a little bit along the way, for example, would say we're all indigenous people. Everybody is an indigenous person, because otherwise you couldn't be, you couldn't live. To be indigenous means to be embedded in a land with which one exists in reciprocity. That's what it means to be indigenous, and to recognize that. And so the task isn't to make a distinction between indigenous and non-indigenous peoples, but for everyone to recognize that they're indigenous. But not everybody among indigenous scholars agrees with that. So Kai White, for example, would say, no, there are indigenous teachings that are ours, and they can't just be extracted. And you know, there's a very well-known article by White and two other indigenous scholars that's called "Indigenous Sustainability is Not for All Humanity." That's the title of the talk. I'd be happy to give you the reference. And so indigenous scholars don't quite agree on this. Some universalize, some propose dialogue, some say we're all indigenous and so on. What I would say is that it depends on what you mean by indigenous. So the UN definition, for a good reason, includes on the one hand indigeneity in the sense that you used it, I think, namely in terms of this temporality as well as the land-based nature of our being. And this is the way that Robin Wall Kimmerer also uses it. But the UN definition includes a second aspect, which is dispossession, colonization, and so on. So you are indigenous when not only do you have this long-standing connection with the land, but you are also dispossessed of that land, right? And then it's of course very problematic to say on the basis of that definition, we're all indigenous. There was violence in our past too. We also suffered. And so that's of course very problematic. So it depends a lot on what you mean by indigeneity. That's my answer to the first question, and that was probably a little bit longer than a minute. And then you asked the question about the definition of generations. And in some of my work, I discussed the various definitions. I think I have 5 different definitions of what a generation is. And there's a lot of literature on this. But I argued in favor of a definition that includes overlap. So that's one of the basic questions. And that was also in your question, is overlap included? Namely, are currently living grandparents and grandchildren and so on, are they a part of one generation or are they different generations? And on my definition, they're different generations because I emphasize the non-contemporaneity of the present with itself, because again, I want to overcome the idea that the present is self-standing and could exist independently of past and future. That's why my definition emphasizes overlap in very strong ways, actually. Although I incorporate some other elements of the kind of definition that you propose, for example, all the currently living, because that's important because that includes the notion of death and mortality. Logical and normative relations with, right? And then there are some other definitions, but I think I can leave that for now. But yes, agency is importantly tied to the kind of notion that definition that I have of generation. So maybe I can leave it at that for that second question. And then the question from the chat about the participation of indigenous peoples, absolutely. I am not an indigenous person myself, and I offer this account of asymmetrical reciprocity as part of a dialogue so that there is participation of indigenous peoples. I think it's very important to read what Indigenous peoples have to say, again, for the reasons I gave you in my preamble, what they have to say about climate politics, how they view climate change and environmental destruction, and so on. So that's a way of addressing the issue of participation. Of course, that's not sufficient at the policy level. It's just shameful, in my view, what's going on with Indigenous peoples. I was at the UN climate change negotiations in Glasgow in November of last year, and there were about 500 registered participants from the fossil fuel industry. They had more passes and higher level passes than all Indigenous peoples from all over the world combined, despite the UN officially recognizing the importance of Indigenous teachings and the importance of Indigenous peoples for managing land that is critical to climate change, such as the Amazon. You had this discrepancy, and Brazil was one of the states that registered a lot of fossil fuel lobbyists. Canada did the same. Shameful, shameful, in my view. I mean, I think the Indigenous pavilion was the smallest of all the pavilions in the climate change negotiations in Glasgow on the premises there. It had no ventilation, and it was packed. The room was packed. You could barely breathe in there with a mask on. And it was surrounded by the pavilion from Saudi Arabia, which had 2 levels and was about 5, 6, 7 times the square meter space that they had available. And it was all just, selling it was greenwashing, basically. So the participation issue is really a big, big issue. I agree with that. The last question from Matilda, thank you for that. I think that the key, you asked the key question that was the key question of my talk as well. How do we inherit gifts that are associated with violence? Right? I think that is the key question when it comes to Indigenous peoples, but also, of course, there are other wrongs, slavery and so on. When it comes to slavery, there's a very good recent book by Femi Taiwo called Reconsidering Reparations that just came out a few months ago. And I think pushes in the same direction that to talk about reparations for slavery is to talk about building a climate just world. So it's not just a question of a little bit of affirmative action here or there, it's about remaking the world. I mean, I would push in the same direction.
Thank you very much, Matthias. I'm a little bit sorry that we went a little bit over the time, but it also shows that the big interest from people here and also from people, in the chat and online. And also congratulations to the team from the Justice team that organized today's talk and managed, also to attract so many people. And I would hand it over to Henrike to say a last word.
Yeah, just quick last words. Yeah, thank you also from my side, Matthias, for this great presentation and also for this great discussion. I think it was really a good and fruitful event today. And also thank you to David, of course, and thank you to the Focal Topic team who was working behind the scenes, the organization team and so on. And one last thing, we will go on a summer break now with our public lecture series, but we will be back at the end of August. And I just want to announce the next lecture, which will happen on August 25th. Our guest will be Esteban Servat. Servat is a biotechnologist, environmental activist, and founder of EcoLeaks. He had to flee his home country, Argentina, because he was doing activism against fracking and mega mining in Mendoza, and is now in Berlin, and he will join us at the end of August. You can see everything on our website. You can subscribe to our newsletter to stay updated about everything. And yeah, thank you very much, and see you again in August, hopefully.